and I'm going to be chairing this second session. We have 3 speakers to go, and we aim to finish promptly by 1 o'clock, by which time I'm sure many of us will be ready for lunch. So our first speaker now is Riona Fumi. She is a research coordinator at the UCL Queen's Square Institute of Neurology. She's been working with Professor Hugh Morris for quite a while. Many of you know Hugh, and so is familiar with the PROSPECT study, now working on the EXPRESS study. So over to you, Riona.
Thank you. Please just shout if you do have problems seeing my screen or hearing me. Okay. Okay. So thank you for having me to speak today. I am going to be talking about improving early diagnosis of the Parkinson plus syndromes like PSP and CBS. So we're talking about a study that we're about to start, a new study called the EXPRESS study. So I am speaking on behalf today of Professor Morris and the whole sort of PSP and CBS team at UCL in London. So just to give you a little bit of a background about the PROSPECT study in general. I'm sure many of you have already heard of the PROSPECT study. It's a large UK-wide based observational study with a large cohort of patients that have atypical Parkinsonism, such as PSP, CBS, and also multiple system atrophy and other forms of atypical Parkinsonian disorders. So we have 29 study sites across the UK. And you can see these study sites are coloured in purple on the right. So this is where the sites are physically based. However, if you actually look at this map here, this is a map of the postcode areas in which our cohort live. So actually, we do cover a very large part of the UK. So we do have some patients who live in Scotland who have either travel to come and see us to take part, or there's also the option of taking part remotely. So we have been able to sort of study patients from all across the UK. So the main aims of the PROSPECT study are to improve early diagnosis in patients. We aim to track disease progression, and we aim to build up a biobank of blood samples, of cerebrospinal fluid samples, etc. And we aim to build up a cohort of patients who will be ready to enter clinical trials. So this study has been running since 2015, and it's been supported by the PSPA and funded by the PSPA. And we have grown a large cohort now of 1,534 patients. So we're very pleased that this cohort has grown so much since 2015. This is a depiction of which patients have been recruited to which arms. There are a few different arms to the study. The majority of the patients have been recruited to the arm called the cross-sectional arm. And that's the sort of lighter touch part of the study, which is accessible to most patients. So we ask patients to complete a questionnaire and to donate a blood sample. And then we have a group of patients who have taken part in these 2 study arms on the right. And these patients have been seen in person and had a much more in-depth assessment. So they've been seen in person by a neurologist and had a clinical assessment. They have done cognitive tests. They have donated extra blood samples where we can look at the different levels of proteins within the blood. And they've had the option of having a lumbar puncture and an MRI. We've also recruited 166 control participants because we, of course, need data to compare to see what the differences are between people with atypical Parkinsonism and without. And then looking at the different disease groups, our largest cohort is PSP. So we have about 700 patients since the start of the study who are recruited with PSP, followed by MSA, CBS. And then we also have a small group of patients who don't fit into sort of a nice clinical syndrome like PSP or CBS, but they do have atypical Parkinsonism. So this is a lot of numbers here. this is essentially just to show how much our biobank has grown. So what we've done since 2015 is we've seen all these patients and we've collected samples. So we have a large biobank of samples which are going to be used, which have already been used for sort of looking at genetic analysis and looking at the different levels of proteins within the blood and cerebrospinal fluid. But we also have plans sort of in the works right now to be running new assays. So we have serum samples and plasma samples. So these are samples which are sort of, they're parts of the blood essentially, and they're very important for looking at different levels. And essentially what we do is we collect these samples at baseline and at follow-up, so we can see how the levels of proteins within the blood are actually changing over time in these disorders as well. And similarly, we have cerebrospinal fluid samples. So we have 155 patients who have had a lumbar puncture, and some of those, so 24 of those, have had lumbar punctures at different time points again. So again, we can be looking at the levels of proteins in these samples across time and across disease progression. And we also have MRI scans. And as you can see at the top, our largest sort of sample pool is DNA samples. So we've been looking into genetics, and we're also running sort of new genetic analysis using all these samples within the next couple of months. Another element of the PROSPECT study is brain donation. So we essentially, everybody that takes part in the PROSPECT study, we give them the option of receiving information about brain donation. So the process of sort of registering as a brain donor is separate. So this isn't, it's not asking patients if they would like to donate their brain. It's just asking patients if they'd like to receive information about brain donation. And we have 221 patients who are registered as brain donors via the PROSPECT study. We have retrieved 103 brains, and we have 18 patients within the cohort for whom we have a full pathology report. And these are the brain banks that are associated with the PROSPECT study. So Queen Square Brain Bank is in UCL, where we're based, and then there are brain banks in Cambridge, Oxford, Newcastle, and also the Imperial Brain Bank, which is also in London. And these make up these are some of the brain banks which make up the UK Brain Banks network. Okay, so in terms of sort of where we've got to so far with the PROSPECT study, we've not only sort of run analysis and run research centrally, but we've also collaborated with other members of the research community. So the important thing about the PROSPECT study is that we really want to be collaborating with as many people that we can. So we've got this large data set, we've got these large number of samples, and we want to make sure that we can do as much as we can with this data. So we've had 34 separate parties who have applied for data or applied for samples from the PROSPECT study. All of the data requests have been approved, and they're approved by a committee. So the most recent, this is just an example of some of the recent collaborations we've had. The most recent collaborations we have set up are with researchers at the University of Plymouth, who are looking into using machine learning to differentiate early PSP and MSA brain imaging. And then we've also collaborated with Andrea Quattrone, who is based at a university in Italy. He's also looking at MRI data. So we've got much of the recent collaborations are to do with imaging. And then we also are looking at quality of life in PSP and MSA, and that's being done with Professor Annette Schrag, who's also based at UCL. That's just an example of how our data is distributed as well. And we've had several outputs from the PROSPECT study. I won't go into too much of this right now because it's not the focus of this particular talk, but these are some of the recent publications that we've had from the PROSPECT study, which will be available online. This is one of the most recent papers, which was published in Brain. This was a very big paper, and essentially researchers at the University of Cambridge looked at patients who were recruited to that, one of the arms where patients were seen in person and then followed up over many years. And they've had a look at the implications of the PROSPECT study on future clinical trials. Right, so what else have we learned from the PROSPECT study? Well, the two things that I want to highlight within this talk specifically are that what we've learned about many different sort of genetic elements of and how they might relate to the progression of PSP. And we've looked at different protein levels in samples with people who have PSP or CBS. But one of the things that we've more recently been looking at is we've been looking at the pathology data. So we've been looking at the data that we have from the patients who have donated their brains to research. Apologies if you've already seen this diagram before. This is essentially a Sankey diagram, which has shown the differences in time between diagnosis at the initial time that people have joined the Prospect study. So on the left here, this is the breakdown of diagnoses that people have when they've signed up to the study. In the middle is patients' final clinical diagnosis. So you can see that patients often have their diagnosis changed across time. Obviously, that's because symptoms progress and the clinical picture might look a little bit different several years on. So you can see that lots of people that were initially diagnosed, well, not lots of people, but a small portion of patients that were initially diagnosed with corticobasal syndrome actually then ended up to have a final clinical diagnosis of PSP. And then on the right here is the pathological diagnosis. So this is the gold standard diagnosis, so the most accurate diagnosis we can receive, and that's by looking at the brain post-mortem. So you can see from here that lots of patients were actually misdiagnosed in life. So several patients that were diagnosed in life with PSP, I'm hoping you can see my cursor right now, but they actually at post-mortem were shown to have corticobasal degeneration. So this is essentially highlighting the level of misdiagnosis that we see in atypical Parkinsonism. So you can also see that some people who had a diagnosis of CBS in life, actually at post-mortem, when we looked at their brains at a pathological level, they had PSP. And it's the same here with MSA as well, where some people with MSA actually, they were diagnosed in life with MSA, but their pathological diagnosis was actually PSP. So the take home from this is there is a need to improve the accuracy of diagnosis in atypical Parkinsonism. And the accuracy of diagnosis, we have, by looking at previous research, the accuracy is improving as we improve our knowledge of these disorders, but there is still a long way to go with this. Also looking at the data from the Prospect study, we know that there is a need to diagnose patients earlier on. So based purely on the Prospect study, we have seen that there is an average delay from motor symptom onset to diagnosis of about 3.5 years in PSP. So that's quite a large delay. And then similarly in multiple system atrophy, the delay between symptom onset and diagnosis is about 3.1 years. So what we really want to do is we really want to be able to diagnose patients more accurately and earlier on. So this leads to the new study that we're running, and this new study is called the EXPRESS study. So the long title is the Early Assessment, Diagnosis and Treatment of Parkinson Plus Related Syndromes, which is a bit of a mouthful, so we've called it EXPRESS. And this study has been, we've received some funding from the MRC, so the Medical Research Council and the NIHR, so at a 50-50. And essentially this grant has come from a larger sort of network called the Rare Disease UK network. So the key aim of this EXPRESS study is to encourage earlier and more accurate diagnosis of the Parkinson plus syndromes. And this will allow for early eligibility into clinical trials. So just to give you an idea of where this sort of fits into the Prospect study, the other arms of the Prospect study, which have been running since 2015, are very much still running. And what we're doing is we're recruiting patients who have a diagnosis of PSP or CBS or MSA or other atypical Parkinsonism, and they will be sort of encouraged to complete questionnaires, a DNA sample, and then there are optional in-person assessments as well. What we're doing, though, is we're sort of expanding the cohort of patients that we're recruiting. So by introducing this EXPRESS study arm, this is actually recruiting patients before their diagnosis. So whereas before the Prospect study was the eligibility criteria was, patients must have a diagnosis of PSP or CBS, we're actually going backwards, and we are recruiting patients who don't yet have a diagnosis. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be screening patients in clinic, and we're going to be looking out for patients who have been recently referred by their GP to clinic for motor or balance problems. So these patients won't yet have a diagnosis, but they will have signs of sort of Parkinsonism features. And these patients may go on to develop Parkinson's disease at a later stage, or they may go on to develop they may go on to get a diagnosis of PSP or CBS, or it may be that actually their changes in motor or balance are related to pathological aging. So at this stage, it's not really possible to tell where this patient will end up, but this is why it's so important to recruit these patients early, because they will be assessed and then they will be followed up, and then they will later will be able to group these patients into Parkinson's disease and non-Parkinson's disease, and then look at the early features which might help us to predict which patients then go on to develop a diagnosis of PSP or CBS. So we just want to capture patients early on, and this is the key aim of this study. So the study assessments will look similar in that they will complete questionnaires and donate a DNA sample. Of these patients who are recruited to the Express arm, there will be a small subset of these patients who we will invite in to take part in person, and they will have sort of extra biomarkers taken. So this will be a more in-depth assessment. We'd like to apply for some more funding soon to sort of develop this arm, but we will be asking patients to come in for a neurological assessment, do some cognitive testing. We'll introduce digital wearables, and they'll have the option of having a lumbar puncture and a skin biopsy if they would like to. So in terms of the eligibility criteria, as I've already highlighted, we're wanting to recruit patients who are sort of in the very early phases and won't yet have a diagnosis of Parkinson's or Parkinson's plus. So we've kept it very broad for the moment, and this main thing that I'd like to highlight here is the inclusion criteria now includes referral to secondary care for assessment of Parkinsonism, dystonia, or gait disorder. So we'd like to recruit patients within 1 year of referral to clinic for Parkinsonism related symptoms. I think what we are aware of is the fact that waiting lists are very long. And it may prove to be difficult to capture these patients very early on, but we will see within time how easy that is, and we will sort of make adjustments to make sure that we are sort of screening different clinics that are seeing patients within the early phases who have recently been referred by their GP. So we'll be asking patients to complete a questionnaire. We will also be asking the researcher or clinician to complete a questionnaire about patient symptoms, and we will also be asking patients to donate a DNA sample. At the Express sites that have the capacity to do so if patients are coming onto site and the researchers have the capacity to take an extra blood sample, we will ask them to spin down those samples, and it will become a plasma sample. And that will be really important because we can look at the different levels of proteins within those samples and then compare them across diagnosis groups later on in time. So patients will be seen at baseline, and then they will be followed up on a regular basis. So we'll ask them to complete a follow-up questionnaire about 3 to 6 months after they've been seen for the first time, and then on a yearly basis until the 4-month mark. And then that it will be exactly the same with the researcher questionnaire as well. So we'll ask the researcher to follow the patient up. And with this, what we'll be able to, at the end of the questionnaire, we will ask, okay, so what diagnosis do you think the patient has? So at the start, it may be that the clinician is unsure what diagnosis the patient is likely to have. And then with time, sort of across the follow-up points, we hope that by the end, the patient will have a diagnosis, whether that be possible or probable. And then we'll be able to compare the groups and look back at the early features, which might help us to predict which patients will end up in which diagnosis group. So with regards to the questionnaires, what we've tried to do is, so we obviously have patient questionnaires and research questionnaires. We want to be able to collect as much data as we can whilst keeping things accessible. We don't want patients to be spending ages and ages on these questionnaires, so much so that they decide that they don't want to complete them. We're trying to make things as concise as possible. And what we're doing is we're including fields that will ask about the patient's symptoms, and we'll also include quantitative data. So that's essentially, we're looking at numeric scales, which will provide rich data to help us understand the severity of patient symptoms. So that will be sort of within the patient questionnaire and the researcher questionnaires as well. Something else that we're introducing to this Express study, which hasn't been done before, is we're going to be introducing the use of digital wearables. So this sort of part of the Express study will be led by colleagues at the University of Oxford. So this will be led by Professor Michelle Hugh. And essentially what we're going to do is we will ask patients who are taking part in this study to take part in an 8-minute long mobile phone test. And this will test for several different things, which is depicted in these images below. So there'll be an app, and the patient what we'll be able to do is we'll be able to look at different reaction times to see how quickly somebody is able to react to things. So that's sort of more attention-based. And then we'll also be looking at finger tapping. So this will be assessing more motor movements, and this is looking at fine motor movements as well, so dexterity in the hands as well. And we'll also be able to look at tremor. So that's what's depicted on the right here. So we'll actually be able to pick up patients' resting tremor. So this again will create data which will be really, really helpful to look at. Sort of, we'll be able to look back and see whether there are any digital markers of movement which can help us to predict diagnosis. Patients will also be given the option to take this home with them, the device, and do a 1 week movement recording at home, and then they will be asked to post the phone back in. Okay, so obviously the aim of the Express study is to promote earlier diagnosis of atypical Parkinsonism. So from our point of view, there are many benefits to receiving a diagnosis of PSP or CBS or MSA earlier on. And those include earlier access to the support that you need. So that's not only sort of from a point of view of clinical support, but it also support such as from the PSP Association. It also means that the likelihood of being eligible to take part in a clinical trial is higher. So some of the clinical trials, which are, may come about in the pipeline, some clinical trials do tend to have fairly stringent eligibility criteria. So patients might need to be within a certain time frame of their diagnosis, or a certain time frame from their onset of symptoms. And it might mean that if you get a diagnosis of PSP sort of 3.5 years later after your symptoms, you may actually be past that point of being eligible to take part in the clinical trial. So what we'd really like to hear from patients as well, what we will be asking patients when we see them, when they're taking part in the study, is, is it important for you to have an early diagnosis? And would you, as somebody that has a diagnosis of PSP or CBS, would you have wanted to be diagnosed earlier on? Because, there are pros, but there also may be negatives to having a diagnosis earlier on. So we would very much welcome patients' perspectives on early diagnosis and why they either would have wanted to be diagnosed earlier or might not have wanted to be diagnosed earlier. So that is something that we would encourage people to open up about, whether that be here, or I've also included the prospect email address if somebody did want to say something about this. So our email address for the study is prospect@ucl.ac.uk.
So just to let you know, we've only got 5 minutes left for questions. So can I just check in? Are you finishing up?
Yeah, this is my last slide. This is just our team at UCL and our contact details here if anybody wanted to contact us about either taking part or with questions after the session. And these are pictures from the Neuro 2023 conference in August last year. And this is our sort of core team based at UCL.
Lovely. Thank you.
Shall I stop sharing my slides?
Yes, thank you. So a couple of questions. The first one from Siobhan, which I think you're planning to answer, Megan, is do you get different information from cerebral spinal fluid than serum or plasma?
Yes. So cerebrospinal fluid is one of the most valuable samples that we could possibly collect. So plasma and serum do offer very good options for looking into biomarkers. But cerebrospinal fluid is sort of before looking at post-mortem, it is the most valuable sample that we could look at. So obviously the option of having a lumbar puncture in this study is it's an option. It's not a core procedure. And that's because obviously a lumbar puncture is a slightly more invasive procedure and not all patients are particularly keen to have one. What we do when we're talking to patients about whether they want to take part in the study, we provide plenty of information and have an in-depth conversation with them about, you know, what a lumbar puncture would entail, etc. So, you know, it is an optional procedure, but it is cerebrospinal fluid is has been sort of, it's preferable over plasma, looking at plasma and serum.
Thank you. We've got a question from Vanessa. Why can none of these diseases be diagnosed before the onset of symptoms, particularly for people who have family members with PSP or CBD?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of people with family members, so there is, in very, very rare cases, we see people who have sort of a family history of PSP or CBS. But for the most part, the atypical Parkinsonian disorders are sporadic, which means that they're not inherited disorders. So for example, with Parkinson's disease, the percentage of patients who have an inherited form of Parkinson's disease is higher, but generally for their atypical Parkinsonian disorders, it's not genetic. So it's not something that unfortunately we're able to say, okay, well, your family member had PSP, so then you are likely to have PSP as well. Unfortunately, that's not, we're not particularly able to predict. And this is obviously what we're looking at doing now by looking at other means of assessments. We're looking at trying to predict who will develop PSP and CBS by looking at rare genetic variants. Why can none of the diseases be diagnosed before the onset of symptoms? Yeah, so hopefully what we'd be able to do in the future is develop a blood test, which would be able to sort of identify proteins or other biomarkers, which would be able to predict. But unfortunately, we're not there yet. So the way that it is at the moment is that patients will present with symptoms, and then the assessments will sort of be done from there.
Thank you. There's a question from Julia about how up-to-date are GPs about the existence of the EXPRESS study, and more generally clued up about PSP and CBD?
Well, certainly for the second part of that question, how clued up are GPs on PSP and CBD? Not very clued up is the answer, depending on the GP. We have seen many patients in the Prospect study who have sort of come in to see us and they've said that their GP hadn't actually heard of PSP or CBS. So this is a really important question because it's really important to be able to increase awareness of PSP and CBS. I know that the PSPA have a red flags list, which I've recently found out about. So it's a list of symptoms that are, you know, for GPs to look at, that might indicate a Parkinson plus syndrome as opposed to Parkinson's disease, because lots of GPs might look at Parkinson's features and think, okay, this is probably Parkinson's disease. Let's refer you to a Parkinson's clinic. So what we'd like to do is, well, we hope that by running the EXPRESS study, we'll be able to raise awareness. And we'd certainly like to raise awareness within sort of other communities and to GPs as well, so that they can in essence, make referrals to the Express study as well. But yeah, targeting GPs is something that is really important, because at the moment it's more sort of the specialist clinicians who know about these disorders and who are able to shed light on these disorders, as opposed to sort of in primary care.
Good, thank you. Well, as we've got to 12.